The Wolf Dog by Walt Morey, Chapter 5. While Copper City slept, Andy and his father carried Kavik through the dark woods and into the back door of Dr. Walker's house. Dr. Walker had a fixed pallet with an old blanket in a corner of his room off his kitchen. They put the dog down carefully and untied the ropes from about his body. Andy's father asked, "Do you want us to stay and help?" "I'll take care of it from here. I want both of you out of here, now." "Vic, we appreciate this, we really do." Sure, now get, will ya?" Andy stroked the unconscious Kavik's big head, and asked Dr. Walker, "Can I see him tomorrow night?" "Make it late," Dr. Walker said. "The later the better. If there's a light in the office, don't come in, because I'll have a patient. Wait until the light's in the back here, and for Pete's sake, be careful. If somebody sees you coming and going out my back door every night, they'll start to wonder." "I'll be very careful," Andy promised. "Don't expect too much," Walker warned. "I'll do all I can, but I'm only human." "Yes, sir," Andy said. "I know." Andy and his father peeked out the kitchen door, saw all was clear, and went hurriedly across the yard into the black protection of the trees. When Andy slipped through the doctor's back door late the following night, he was sure for a sick minute that Kavik was dead. The dog lay as if he had never moved, his eyes closed. There was a cast on one front leg, as well as a white patch on his flank where the lynx had torn him. A bottle was fastened to the back of a chair with a tube running down to the dog's head. The liquid in the bottle was half gone. It seemed to Andy's anxious eyes that Kavik looked thinner, weaker than ever. "He's still alive," Dr. Walker said. "He's got 3 broken ribs, but luckily none of them punctured a lung. His front leg is broken, his pelvis is broken. There's a hole in his other side as big as a 50-cent piece where a piece of metal stabbed almost completely through him. He's got a lot of blood. He's lost a lot of blood." "Isn't he going to live?" Andy asked fearfully. "I'm not sure yet." Andy knelt beside Kavik and began stroking his head gently. Dr. Walker picked up a book and sat in an old rocker under the light and began reading. From time to time he glanced at the boy. Finally he closed his book and said gruffly, "I've done all I can for him. The rest is up to him and nature. But he's got one big thing in his favor." "What's that?" "He's part wolf. That gives him a toughness an all dog doesn't have. Anyway," Dr. Walker grumbled, "he'd have to be tougher than a whalebone to live through your horsing him up on that chunk of plain wing and then dragging him through the snow." "I was very careful," Andy said. "I eased him out of the cage and slid him onto the wing. I didn't lift or pull him. I didn't tie him right tight on the wing either, just tight enough so he wouldn't slide off. And I didn't jerk when I pulled the wing through the snow. I did give him a drink. Maybe I shouldn't have." "How'd you do that?" Andy explained how he'd packed his handkerchief with snow, let it melt, and then dripped a few drops from the soaked handkerchief into Kavik's mouth. Giving him a drink of water was good. "You're sure he swallowed?" "I stroked his throat like this. I felt him swallow." Dr. Walker's dark eyes studied the boy. "Did you have first aid in school?" "We've never had such a thing." Walker opened his book and began to read again. After a minute he glanced at Andy and muttered again, Several minutes later the bell rang on the office door. Dr. Walker put aside his book with a sigh. "Somebody with a bellyache," he grumbled. You be quiet in here." Andy sat stroking Kavik's head and watched the liquid from the bottle trickle slowly down the tube into his body. A minute later Dr. Walker came into the kitchen. "That crazy Gabby Nelson ran a sliver in his hand this time of night." He shook his head. "I'd better go." Andy rose. He stood looking down at the wasted figure of the dog. The breath of life barely stirred his sunken flanks, and not once tonight had he looked at Andy. Andy's eyes followed a drop of liquid from the bottle down the tube where it disappeared into the dog's vein. By so little was his life held. A wave of despair rushed over Andy, and he said in a thick voice, "He's going to die. I know he is." He turned and went quickly out the door. But Kavik did not die. There was nothing soft or flabby in his makeup. He clung to the slender thread of life with his tenacity only a half-wild creature, raised and toughened to the trail by a man such as Charlie One-Eye could know. Each night Andy was relieved to find Kavik still alive. He watched as the bottle slowly fed the precious life drops into the dog's bloodstream, but Kavik didn't move or open his eyes. It was on the 3rd night, when Andy knocked softly on Dr. Walker's door and was admitted, that he found Kavik's eyes open, and the bottle and tube no longer attached to him. "He's going to live, isn't he?" Andy asked happily. Dr. Walker permitted himself a faint smile. "He'll live, but he's not out of the woods yet." Andy knelt beside Kavik and reached out to stroke his head. As the dog's eyes watched the hand, he seemed to try to draw away, but was too weak. "He's not used to being petted or handled," Dr. Walker said. "All he knows about a hand is getting belted by it." Andy let his fingers touch the sharp pointed ears, stray down, and scratched gently at their roots. "What do you mean, he's not out of the woods?" "I don't know if he's going to make a full recovery." "How can we tell when he has?" If he doesn't limp on that front leg, if the pelvis heals properly, and if his back legs get strong enough again, Andy continued, scratching lightly at the base of Kvik's ears. It seemed to him that the dog relaxed a little. When will you be sure? How should I know? Dr. Walker shook his head, annoyed. You're the darnest kid for rushing things. I told you, nature will have to do the job. That it'll take time. I just want him to be all right. Sure, Dr. Walker. Dr. Walker went to the cupboard, took out the remains of a roast, cut off a handful of small pieces, and handed them to Andy. Here, feed him. He can eat now? Of course, that's why I quit the intravenous feeding. Andy held a piece of meat toward Kvik, but the dog pulled his head away and watched him warily. Put it on the floor, Dr. Walker said. He's not used to being hand-fed. Andy put the meat within reach of the floor. Kvik moved his head forward and smelled it carefully. Finally, he took the meat and swallowed it. Andy fed him the remainder piece by piece. The front doorbell rang, and before Dr. Walker could rise to go into the office, the kitchen door opened, and a little Gabby Nelson stood there. His name was really Henry, and everyone said he was not too bright. But to Copper City he was Gabby because he was always repeating everything he knew. He held out his bandaged hand and said in a high, squeaky voice, Doc, you said to come back tonight so you could look at this, remember? Dr. Walker tried to move between Gabby and the open back room door so he couldn't see Kvik. Andy reached for the door to swing it closed when Gabby looked around the doctor's lean frame and saw them. He moved into the kitchen and looked at Andy and Kvik. A dog, he said. You doctoring a dog, Doc? This is a very special dog, Gabby, Dr. Walker said easily, and tried to lead Gabby out of the kitchen. This is the dog that won the North American at Fairbanks a few days ago. He's a champion, Gabby. Gabby refused to be moved and kept looking at Kvik. You ain't a dog doctor. You're a people doctor. That's right, but this is a valuable dog. He needed help or he'd have died. But dogs, Doc, Gabby insisted. You use the same knives and scissors and things like that on him you use on me? Medicines too, Doc? I don't like him getting the same medicines I do. Dr. Walker led Gabby into the office and pointed to the small cabinet. Everything I use is sterilized in there, Gabby. Everything, understand? Sure, Doc, but using them on a dog and giving people medicines to a dog, Gabby shook his head. Town sure wouldn't like it, did it know? It's not going to know, Dr. Walker said. Sure wouldn't like it, Gabby shook his head gravely. Nobody knows but you, Dr. Walker said sternly. So if the town finds out about the dog, they're going to hear what you've been doing up there in the old mine shaft all these years. You know the whole town will stampede up there, and all your work will be stomped out of sight. Aw, now, Doc, you wouldn't, Gabby said, suddenly fearful. Nobody knows but you. I'm right close to hitting the big vein. I know I am. Then you'd better be sure nobody hears about this dog. I wasn't going to say nothing. Honest, you can count on me, Doc. All right, Dr. Walker agreed. As long as nobody learns about the dog, your secret's safe, but not 1 second longer. Okay, Gabby thrust out a grimy hand. You got a deal. They shook hands gravely. Then Dr. Walker said, Now come over here and let me look at that hand. Dr. Walker returned to the kitchen a few minutes later, and Andy asked briefly, Do you think Gabby will tell? If he does, he knows I'll broadcast about his activities in the mine shaft. He doesn't want that. What's he doing up there? Andy asked. Dad says that shaft's been abandoned for years. Gabby has the crazy idea he's going to uncover a new vein of copper and that he'll become rich and Copper City will boom again. Nobody knows but you? That's what he says. He sneaks up there and every desk and works half the night shoring up the old tunnel and digging new tunnels. He's done an amazing amount of work. I learned about it a year ago when a rock fell on his foot. He couldn't pay his doctor bill, so he told me about the mine and promised me a big stake in his new strike. Dr. Walker stood frowning thoughtfully. Maybe I scared Gabby enough and maybe I didn't, but he could forget and talk. If he does, I know a few busybodies who'd just love to start snooping and spreading tales. If they discovered the dog, I'd be in trouble. But if they didn't, they'd put it down to more of Gabby's blabbing and forget about it. We've got to get Kvik out of here tonight, Andy. Is it safe to take him? I've done all I can. He's getting no medicine now, no intravenous feeding. He just needs a lot of rest and all he can eat. He can get that at your place just as well as here. I'd like to have kept him a couple more days, but it's too dangerous. Get that wing section out of the corner. They eased Kvik onto the wing tip and tied him securely. Then Dr. Walker and Andy carried him back through the dark trees to the Evans home. Laura brought blankets and made him a bed in the corner of the kitchen. He's not used to a house and being around people, so this will be good for him, she said. No male, man, or dog can resist a woman's kitchen. You may be right, Dr. Walker agreed. They eased Kvik off the wing tip and onto the blankets. Dr. Walker said, All he needs is the usual care, water and food. Let him sleep. He should do a lot of sleeping." "What if he tries to get up?" Laura asked. "He won't until he knows he can. He's smarter than some patients I've had. When he does get up, have Andy come for me. I'll take the cast off his leg, and soon we'll see how he looks, and Andy. Come at night." "Then you think he'll make a full recovery?" Andy's father asked. "I don't know, but we'll get a pretty good idea once he starts moving around." So, Kavik was settled in a corner of Laura's worm kitchen. Every night when Andy came in from school, his first questions were, "Has Kavik got up yet? Has he walked?" "Not yet," his mother would answer. "Remember, Dr. Walker said it would take time." Andy would kneel beside the dog, stroke his fur, scratch at the roots of his sharp ears, and say anxiously, "He's looking better, don't you think, Mother? I'm sure he's gaining a little weight. His ribs don't stick out so much. He ought to get up soon, hadn't he?" But Kavik didn't get up. He didn't even try. He continued to sleep long hours, and sometimes he dreamed. Through his mind paraded the events of his short, hard life. There were the shouting and cursing of Charlie One-Eye, the sting of the lash, the solid mash of his hard hand. He lived again his countless fights with the rest of the team. He felt the biting cold of 40 below when he burrowed deep in the snow for protection. Once more he ran through the brutal months of training, digging in with raw, bleeding feet, pulling until he was ready to drop. For this he had been fed only one small fish a day. Hunger was an ache that never left. Over and over he ran the grueling miles of the North America. But there was one particular nightmare through which he suffered again and again. The terrible ride, trapped in the iron cage in the dark interior of the plane. He heard the roaring sounds again, felt the slipping, the falling. He went through the horror of the explosion, the burst of light. Then he and the cage would go spinning, end over end, through space. At such times his muscles jerked, and he whimpered in his sleep. This would bring the woman, and her soft voice and gentle hands would wake him. At first the dreams seemed more real to Kavik than the kitchen. He had lived through the dreams, but the nearest he had come to being inside a house with people had been his short stay in Dr. Walker's back room. He remembered a little of that. Now he was living with people. He heard the cold winter wind bite at the corners of the house while he lay warm on his blanket. His delicate black nostrils were filled with the delicious odors of cooking food, and he ate this food every night from a white bowl. Not once did he taste the half-thawed fish that had been his chief diet for the 2 years of his life. Kavik was 3/4 dog, but Charlie One-Eye had cultivated the wolf in him. The dog part wanted the companionship, the love, the attention of people. Now these dormant emotions came alive in him. At first he tried to object to the hands stroking and petting him, but he was too weak. Then he became accustomed to their touch, and soon he was waiting expectantly for it. He knew the different hands without opening his yellow eyes. The man's hands were heavy, his strokes and pats were solid but gentle. The boy's touch was lighter, but it was sure and smooth, and he kept much more time stroking him. He spent much more time. The woman's hands were soft and light. Not once did he receive a stinging cuff followed by shouted commands and curses. These hands stroked and petted, and the voices were quiet and friendly. Kavik was a young dog, and the time he'd spent under the rough treatment of Charlie One-Eye had not yet made his nature permanently harsh and unyielding. He responded to these people, but it was to the boy he gave his love. As Andy's mother said, "It's logical, there's not much difference between a boy and a dog, and considering that a dog's years are 7-to-1 in ratio to human, they're about the same age. It's youth answering to youth." Each day Kavik waited for the boy to return from school. He would lie his head up, ears pricked forward. He could catch the quick crunch of the boy's feet in the snow long before human ears could. Andy always went straight to Kavik, and knelt beside him to stroke his head and scratch at the base of his ears, while he searched for improvement. He would say anxiously, "Seems like he ought to walk pretty soon. He ought to try anyway. He can't get strong just lying there." And his mother always answered, "Stop trying to rush it. Dr. Walker said Kavik will know when he can get up." Kavik would lift his head toward the boy, and his black nostrils sucked in the clean, fresh scent of the outdoors that clung to the boy's clothing. The boy would talk to him, his voice low and intimate, while his fingers went on exploring at the roots of his ears or under his chin. Kavik learned to roll his big head, so this marvelous sensation was transferred from one side to the other. Each night Andy would hold forth some tempting morsel of food and coax him to take it, but for a reason that went back to the first time Charlie One-Eye had sent the pup sprawling with that stinging slap of his big hand, he could not bring himself to stretch forth his head and take it. Andy always ended up putting the morsel on of food in his bowl, whence it was immediately taken. Kavik enjoyed most of the time after dinner. The kitchen was warm, and the faint aroma of cooking still lingered. The 3 people sat about the table, taking advantage of the overhead light. The boy would be studying, his brown head bent over books. The man read a paper or magazine, and the woman was usually mending some article of clothing or knitting on a sweater she was making for the man. Kavik would stretch full length, close his eyes, and listen to their low voices and bask in the wonderful feeling of belonging. After a time, the boy would put away his books, get out a comb and brush, and sit on the floor beside him. All right, he said, time to get beautiful. Then for half an hour he'd brush and comb the dog's wolf-gray coat. Finally the boy would put the comb and brush away, set a pan of fresh water before him, smooth the wrinkles from his blanket, give his big head some final pats, and disappear up the stairs. The older people would stay a while longer. Then the man put out the light, and they followed the boy. Kavik would be alone in the kitchen. There came a night when the family was eating dinner, and Andy's father was talking about the coming canning season. Andy felt a touch at his arm and looked down to find Kavik at his elbow, balancing shakily on 3 legs. Andy yelled, "Dad! Mom! Look! Look! He's got up! Kavik's got up!" He put his arms around the dog's neck and looked at his father, his eyes shining. "He can walk, Dad! He's going to make it! He's going to be all right, isn't he?" Kurt leaned across the table and studied the dog. "Looks promising," he agreed. "We'll see what Vic Walker says." Andy started up. "I'll get him so he can take the cast off his front leg. He said to come for him when Kavik got up." "It's too early," his mother said. "Victor told you to come when it was dark. You eat your supper." Andy sank back in his chair. Kavik kept looking at him, his tail waving. Andy took a bite of meat and held it under the dog's nose as he had been doing every night for days. Kavik licked his lips and looked at the meat, then up at Andy. "Come on," Andy coaxed. "I'm going to keep right on until you take it. You might as well start now." The yellow eyes of the dog and the blue ones of the boy looked into each other. Then Kavik rolled back his lips from the big tearing teeth and reached forward cautiously. He lifted the meat from Andy's palm so deftly the boy scarcely felt it. Andy patted his head and crooned, "That's a good boy. That's good." He proffed another piece. Kavik took it. Andy reached for a third. "No, you don't," his mother said. "You eat that." Kavik had his dinner, and he stuffed. Kavik stood expectantly at Andy's elbow for another minute. Then he hobbled back to his blanket and lay down. That had taken all his strength. Andy was so excited he scarcely touched his food. His father and mother held him back to it 2 endless hours before they finally let him go for Dr. Walker. After Dr. Walker had examined the dog critically, he said, "He's looking surprisingly good. He's put on weight. He's a mighty tough animal." They gathered around and watched silently as he carefully got the cast away. Kavik lay there for several minutes, as if he weren't sure what he should do. Then he scrambled up. He wobbled uncertainly on 3 legs, then carefully, slowly put the 4th on the floor. The act seemed to give him confidence. His sharp ears shot forward, his back straightened. He seemed to grow taller and to stand with purpose. He dropped his head in a typical wolf gesture and looked obliquely up at them with yellow eyes. "Good heavens," Andy's mother said. "He does look like a wolf." "A big Arctic wolf," Andy's father said. "A throwback, sure." "Lead him around a little," Dr. Walker said to Andy. "Let's see how he walks." Andy coaxed Kavik through the kitchen, into the dining room and the living room, and back into the kitchen. The moment he began to walk, all that fine confidence deserted him. His head dropped and his ears flattened. He limped terribly, and when he reached the kitchen again, he collapsed panting on his blanket into the corner. Andy looked at Dr. Walker fearfully, trying to read his long, sober face as he studied Kavik. Andy's father looked at his feet and said nothing. His mother bit her lips. Andy knelt and stroked Kavik's head and waited, scarcely daring to breathe. He could hear Kavik's labored panting and feel his whole body tremble with the effort. He wanted Dr. Walker to say Kavik was going to be all right more than he'd ever wanted anything, but he feared the doctor wasn't going to. The wreck, the injuries, and lying out there in that iron cage in the storm had been more than even his wolf-tough constitution could overcome. He was not making a full recovery. Maybe they should have put Kavik to sleep the first night when Dr. Walker wanted to. "Sure, he's weak and he's got a bad lump," Dr. Walker said. "He's been through a mighty tough ordeal. I told you his chances were less than 50-50. When I got him home and began working on him, I realized they were even less. I wouldn't have given a plugged nickel for his chances that first night." He leaned forward and scratched Kavik's ears. "You're about as tough as they come." He looked at Andy then and said, "I told you that wolf strain was tough, boy." Andy's heart almost stopped, then began to race madly. "You mean he's going to be all right? He's going to get well? He'll make a full recovery?" Dr. Walker asked. I'd bet on it. Naturally, he's stiff and weak, but with exercise, he'll grow strong again. That stiffness will limber up and disappear." Andy put his head down on to Kavik and murmured, "You hear that? You're going to be all right again." Kavik sniffed at the boy. Then, for the first time in his life, he ran out his pink tongue and licked a human face. Dr. Walker snapped his bad clothes and rose. Andy's father asked, "How much do we owe you, Vic?" "I said I'd pay it, Dad," Andy said quickly. Never mind, Andy. It was Andy's idea to get Dr. Walker, Andy's mother said. He should pay his own bill. Dr. Walker looked at Andy. Where you going to get this money? Out of my trapping money. I see. Dr. Walker rubbed his long jaw thoughtfully. Bring me about $5 sometime. Now, Vic, Kurt began. That will hardly pay for the cast, Andy's mother said. You said that was Andy's bill. Then let Andy and me settle it. Of course that $5 won't pay the whole bill, but not by a long shot, he said to Andy. But if I know your folks, you're going to college. You just might decide to study medicine. If you do, and some kid brings you a sick dog, see that you take care of him, understand? Yes, sir, Andy said, and I'll bring the money to your office tomorrow morning. Good enough. Dr. Walker picked up his hat. You grouchy old bear, Laura said softly. You're a fraud. Dr. Walker scowled at her. Kurt, he said, how do you manage to live with this woman? And left. After Dr. Walker had gone, Andy coaxed Kvik into 2 more tours of the kitchen, dining room, and living rooms, and each time he collapsed, panting on his blanket. But it seemed to Andy that he was a little steadier the last time. He patted Kvik's head and said, You did fine, just fine. Kvik thumped his tail on the floor and lifted his lips in a grin. Andy's father said, You're not forgetting that Kvik belongs to Mr. Hunter. You'll have to give him up, you know. Andy rubbed Kvik's ears, and the dog laid his head on his knee. Andy kept rubbing his ears. He had forgotten. He'd been so full of wanting Kvik to get well, there'd been no room for any other thought. Now it suddenly lay on his stomach like a rock. When will you tell Mr. Hunter about him, he asked. I'll write him tomorrow and explain everything. Do you have to write so soon? Kvik's not clear well yet, Dad. Kurt's thinking always followed a straightforward, simple line. Right was right, wrong was wrong, and the truth must always be told. Mr. Hunter thinks his dog is dead. He should know he's alive and that he's going to recover. Laura sat nibbling at a fingernail, and now she said thoughtfully, I don't think you should tell him just yet. Mr. Hunter's accepted the fact of Kvik's death. If you tell him he's alive, he'll want him back immediately. If he sees a thin, scraggly, weak dog that limps badly, he'll get rid of him. It's not fair to Mr. Hunter or to Kvik for him to see that dog now. Kvik won't be fit for a couple of months. In that time, the cannery will open for the spring run, and Mr. Hunter will be coming north as usual. Let him see Kvik then, and when he looks again like the big, strong dog that won the North American. As Andy washed his father's face, he added anxiously, Kvik doesn't look very good, Dad. Kurt scowled at the dog while he thought through this carefully. All right, he agreed finally. We'll wait. But don't forget you'll have to give him up. I know, Andy said. He sat there a few minutes longer, stroking and petting the dog. Finally, he rose and filled Kvik's water bowl and put it beside him. He straightened the blanket a little. Then he said good night to his parents, patted Kvik's head again, and climbed the stairs. The dog watched him out of sight. A little later, Laura and Kurt turned out the light, and Kvik was left in the darkness of the kitchen. He lay for some time looking at the stairway up which the boy had disappeared. Finally, he rose laboriously, limped to the foot of the stairs, and looked up. The boy was up there somewhere. He put a paw on the first step and began to climb. Lifting his weight up each step was harder than walking. Soon his legs began to tremble. Halfway up, he sat down on the steps and rested. Then he went on. At the top, he faced a short hall with 2 doors. His delicate nose led him unerringly to the boy's door. The door was ajar, and he pushed it open. He walked across to the bed and put his cold nose against the boy's cheek. Andy sat up with a start. Kvik, you climbed the stairs! You climbed the stairs! He put his hands on either side of the big head and pressed his face against the furry forehead. You're sure getting strong fast. I knew you would. I knew it. Kvik waved his tail gravely and licked Andy's face. So you want to sleep with me, Andy said. That's dandy. Andy pulled a throw rug on the floor to a place at the head of the bed. He patted it and said, Come on, lie down, right here. Kvik curled up on the rug with a tired sigh. He felt the nearness of the boy in the bed beside him, his hand trailing over the side, touching him. The smell of the boy filled his nostrils. This was where he wanted to be.